Deep inside the Taklamakan Desert, one of the driest and most hostile places on Earth, archaeologists pulled bodies out of the sand that should not have existed according to everything historians thought they knew about ancient China. These weren't skeletons, they were mummies, naturally preserved for up to 4,000 years, with red and light-colored hair still visible, European-style facial features still intact, and clothing unlike anything found anywhere else in the region. No one had an answer, not for decades. For decades, scientists could not explain who these people were, where they came from, or how they ended up buried in one of the most isolated deserts on the planet. What the DNA eventually revealed didn't just solve the mystery, it rewrote a piece of human history that had been confidently wrong for almost a century. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what scientists found, why it broke every existing theory, and what the actual truth turned out to be. The Tarim Basin sits in China's Xinjiang region, and it's almost entirely covered by the Taklamakan Desert, a place so unforgiving that its name is often translated as roughly meaning you go in, but you never come out. Annual precipitation in the region often falls below 100 millimeters, the soil is highly saline, and winters are brutally cold. It's exactly the kind of environment where nothing organic should survive for long. And yet, starting with early European explorers in the beginning of the 20th century, and accelerating dramatically with major excavations at sites like Xiaohe and Lulan starting in the 1990s, archaeologists began pulling out hundreds of naturally mummified human remains dating from roughly 2000 BCE all the way up to around 200 CE. These bodies weren't embalmed or ritually preserved through any deliberate human process. The extreme aridity, the salty soil, and the freezing winters did the preservation work entirely on their own, essentially freeze-drying these people inside their graves for millennia. The first thing that struck researchers, and the thing that ignited nearly a century of debate, was how these mummies actually looked. One of the most famous individuals, nicknamed the Beauty of Lulan, discovered by archaeologist Wang Binghua in 1980, displayed facial features and coloring that looked distinctly non-Asian. Across multiple burial sites, researchers kept finding mummies with fair skin, light-colored or reddish hair, and bone structure that looked more consistent with European populations than with the East Asian populations that history books said had always lived in that region. They were buried wearing felt and woven wool clothing, styles that stood out as genuinely unusual for Central Asia at that time period, and many were interred in strange boat-shaped wooden coffins covered with cattle hides and marked above ground with timber poles carved to resemble oars, as if these desert dwellers had once lived somewhere with rivers or seas central to their identity, buried 1,000 miles from any ocean. This combination of physical appearance, clothing, and burial customs led to an assumption that dominated archaeology for decades. Many researchers concluded these people simply couldn't be indigenous to the region at all. The leading theory held that the Tarim mummies represented Proto-Tocharian-speaking pastoralists, an early branch of the Indo-European language family, who had migrated eastward from the Eurasian steppe, possibly descended from a Bronze Age culture called Afanasyevo, or alternatively connected to a Central Asian civilization known as the Bactria-Margiana archaeological complex. In plain terms, the assumption was that these were outsiders, migrants who had traveled enormous distances from the West, bringing European genetics, European-style clothing, and Indo-European language directly into the heart of China thousands of years before. Anyone thought that kind of long-distance movement was even possible in that era. For nearly 100 years, that migration theory sat largely unchallenged, repeated across textbooks and documentaries as the accepted explanation for why these Bronze Age mummies looked the way they did. It fit neatly into a broader historical narrative about ancient trade routes, cultural diffusion, and population movement across the Eurasian steppe. The problem was that nobody had actually tested it against the genetic evidence, because the technology to properly sequence ancient DNA from remains this old and this degraded simply didn't exist yet. That changed in 2021, when an international team of researchers, combining Chinese, European, and American institutions, published a landmark genomic study in the journal Nature that finally put the migration theory to a real scientific test, and the results overturned almost everything the field had assumed for decades. The team sequenced genomic data from 5 individuals dating to around 3000 to 2800 BCE from the nearby Dzungarian Basin, and 13 individuals dating to around 2100 to 1700 BCE from the Tarim Basin itself, representing the earliest human remains ever discovered from both northern and southern Xinjiang. What they found flipped the entire narrative on its head. The early Bronze Age. Tarim individuals showed essentially no significant genetic connection to the Afanasyevo culture, no meaningful Western steppe-related ancestry at all, and no genetic signature linking them to the Bactria-Margiana archaeological complex or any other proposed migrant population. Instead, the study found these people carried what researchers described as purely local ancestry, meaning they weren't recent arrivals from anywhere. They had been there for a very long time, likely far longer than anyone previously imagined. Specifically, the genetic data trace their ancestry back to a group scientists call ancient North Eurasians, a relatively small population of Ice Age hunter-gatherers who had migrated into Central Asia from West Asia many thousands of years before the Bronze Age even began. This lineage carries genetic links to modern Europeans, which explains the physical features that had puzzled researchers for so long. But it also carries deep genetic connections to indigenous populations in Siberia, and, remarkably, Native American populations in North America. In other words, the same ancient genetic thread running through these desert mummies also runs through people on the opposite side of the planet, a connection nobody would have guessed just by looking at where these bodies were buried. Harvard and Max Planck Institute anthropologist Christina Warner, one of the study's co-authors, summed up just how strange this population had been to work with, saying they've been so enigmatic ever since they were found almost by accident, because so many aspects of them are either unique, puzzling, or contradictory. What the genetic data ultimately revealed was that this wasn't a story about migration at all. It was a story about isolation. The earliest Tarim Basin population appears to have been a genetically isolated local group, one that had likely remained largely separate from surrounding populations for thousands of years, adapting to one of the harshest environments on the planet almost entirely on its own, developing a distinct culture shaped by extreme necessity rather than absorbed through contact with distant civilizations. That isolation becomes even more remarkable when you consider what these people actually managed to build for themselves inside the Taklamakan Desert. Researchers examining dental calculus, the hardened plaque that builds up on ancient teeth, found strong evidence of milk proteins among individuals at the Xiaohe site, indicating these people had relied on dairy pastoralism since the very founding of their settlement. That detail matters because it shows a level of agricultural sophistication and animal domestication knowledge that an isolated population had to have developed or adapted largely on their own terms, inside an environment that offered almost nothing in the way of natural resources. That dairy connection led directly to one of the most remarkable follow-up discoveries in this entire story, one that only came to light in 2024. Decades after the mummies were first excavated, archaeologists had noticed strange, yellowish, pebble-sized substances scattered around the necks and heads of several individuals buried at the Xiaohe Cemetery, dating to roughly 3,600 years ago. For years, nobody could say for certain what this material actually was. Then a research team led by Qiaomei Fu, director of the Ancient DNA Laboratory at the Institute of Vertebrate Paleontology, and paleoanthropology in Beijing, successfully extracted and sequenced DNA directly from that substance. The results, published in the journal Cell, confirmed it was cheese, specifically kefir cheese, made through a fermentation process using both cow and goat milk, and containing ancestral strains of the same probiotic bacteria found in modern kefir cultures today, including Lactobacillus kefiranofaciens. Fu described it plainly, calling it the oldest known cheese sample ever discovered anywhere in the world, adding that food items like cheese are extremely difficult to preserve over thousands of years, which made this an exceptionally rare opportunity to study ancient diet and culture directly, rather than through indirect archaeological inference. The discovery didn't just set a new record for the oldest confirmed cheese in human history. It fundamentally challenged existing assumptions about where kefir itself originated. Kefir has traditionally been associated almost exclusively with the Caucasus mountain region near Russia, but this genetic analysis revealed that the bacterial strains found on the Tarim mummies showed a closer connection to Tibetan kefir cultures than to Caucasus varieties, suggesting the fermentation tradition may have spread into northwestern China from Tibet during the Bronze Age, and that it has been continuously maintained in that region for well over 3,000 years. There's an additional layer of practical genius hidden inside that discovery, too. Researchers noted that the ancient Xiaohe people made their cheese in separate batches, using either cow milk or goat milk individually rather than mixing them together, a technique notably different from the blended milk methods commonly used in ancient Middle Eastern and Greek cheesemaking traditions. Beyond flavor or tradition, fermentation through kefir culture significantly reduces the natural lactose content in dairy, which would have made this cheese considerably easier to digest for populations that were likely lactose intolerant. A detail that hints at a sophisticated, almost scientific level of dietary problem-solving happening inside a Bronze Age desert community that left no written records behind to explain their own reasoning. Putting all of these pieces together completely reframes what the original headline-making claim actually meant. This wasn't a population that appeared out of nowhere, defying known human migration patterns through some inexplicable event. It was something arguably more remarkable. An isolated group of ancient hunter-gatherer descendants, cut off from major surrounding civilizations for thousands of years, who nonetheless independently developed animal domestication, sophisticated dairy fermentation techniques, distinctive textile production, and a unique burial culture featuring boat-shaped coffins, entirely on their own terms, deep inside one of the most hostile environments on the planet. The mystery was never really about them not fitting into human history. It was about human history not yet having a category broad enough to fit them into, until the genetic evidence finally forced researchers to build one. It's worth being clear and honest about what this discovery does and doesn't actually prove, because separating verified science from speculation matters here. The genetic and archaeological evidence conclusively demonstrates that the earliest Tarim Basin population was locally rooted, rather than a recent migrant group, and that their distinctive appearance traces back to a much older ancient North Eurasian lineage rather than a direct steppe migration during the Bronze Age itself. What remains genuinely open for continued research includes exactly how isolated this population truly was over multiple centuries, how their distinctive culture, including the felt clothing, boat coffins, and specific burial rituals, actually developed, and how later individuals in the Tarim Basin eventually came to speak Tocharian, an extinct Indo-European language recorded in Buddhist religious texts dating to between 500 and 1000 CE, a linguistic connection that still isn't fully explained by the current genetic data alone, since language and genetics don't always move together, as history has repeatedly demonstrated in other regions of the world. There's also ongoing academic debate about later populations in the wider Xinjiang region. The nearby Dzungarian Basin individuals from the same 2021 study did show predominantly Afanasyevo-related ancestry alongside a smaller local genetic contribution, which suggests migration and genetic mixing absolutely did happen elsewhere in the broader region during the Bronze Age. It simply wasn't the primary story for the earliest Tarim Basin population specifically, the group whose mummies first sparked this entire decades-long mystery. That distinction matters enormously for accuracy, because it would be misleading to claim no migration ever happened anywhere near this desert. The genuinely surprising finding is narrower and honestly more interesting than a simple migration story would have been. One specific, geographically isolated population, thriving against extraordinary odds inside a nearly uninhabitable desert, using resourcefulness and adaptation rather than large-scale outside contact to survive for well over 1,000 years. The broader significance of this discovery extends well past a single archaeological curiosity buried in a Chinese desert. It's a case study in how quickly established scientific consensus can be completely overturned once new technology becomes available. In this instance, ancient DNA sequencing capable of extracting reliable genetic information from remains thousands of years old and severely degraded by time. For nearly a century, respected historians and archaeologists confidently repeated a migration theory rooted almost entirely in visual observation and reasonable-sounding cultural inference, without ever having the tools required to actually test that theory against hard genetic evidence. When those tools finally arrived, the accepted story didn't survive contact with the data. That's not really a story about ancient mysteries or people who somehow don't fit into known human history at all. It's a story about how much of what we confidently believe about the deep past is still fundamentally provisional, waiting patiently for better instruments and more rigorous testing to either confirm it or, just as often, quietly rewrite it entirely. To really appreciate how strange this culture was, it helps to look closer at the individual burials themselves rather than just the genetics behind them. One of the most famous mummies from this entire collection is known as the Beauty of Xiaohe, sometimes called the Princess of Xiaohe, buried at least 3,500 years ago at Urdex Necropolis, a site named after the local hunter who first stumbled upon it decades earlier, along the dried-up bed of what was once the Xiaohe River. Her remains are considered exceptionally well preserved even by the standards of this site, with visible eyelashes, defined facial contours, and clothing patterns still largely intact after millennia buried beneath desert sand. Alongside her and many others at Xiaohe, archaeologists recovered woven baskets rather than pottery, a detail that stood out immediately, since basketry over ceramics wasn't a common preference among most other Bronze Age cultures documented across the wider region. Some burials also included small bundles of ephedra twigs, a plant used across various ancient cultures for its stimulant properties, placed in a style that echoed burial customs seen among oasis cultures further west in Central Asia, hinting at least some degree of shared symbolic tradition even amid genetic isolation. Then, there are the boat coffins themselves, arguably the single strangest and most consistent feature across the entire Xiaohe burial ground. Bodies were placed inside coffins literally shaped like boats, covered over with fresh cattle hides that would have shrunk tightly around the wood as they dried, sealing each burial almost airtight in a way that likely contributed significantly to how well these remains survived the passage of time. Above ground, tall wooden poles resembling oars or paddles marked each grave, some of them elaborately carved, rising out of the desert sand like a small forest of markers stretching across the burial ground. No major river existed anywhere near enough to explain this obsession with boat imagery as a practical, everyday necessity. Researchers have proposed it may have functioned instead as a symbolic tribute, a spiritual reference to the rivers and oases that made survival possible at all in an otherwise completely inhospitable desert, transforming a practical resource into a central piece of religious or cultural identity that carried all the way through into how these people chose to honor their dead. Picture that scene for a second. A community with no ocean, no major river, buried in one of the driest places humans have ever survived, still choosing to send their dead off inside boats, marked by oars pointing up out of the sand, like a forest that never sailed anywhere. That's not decoration. That's identity, carved directly into how an entire culture chose to say goodbye to its own people, generation after generation, for over 1,000 years. But the story takes one more turn. Centuries later, people in this exact same region were speaking Tocharian, an extinct Indo-European language, preserved today only through Buddhist manuscripts dating between 500 and 1000 CE. Here's the puzzle. If the earliest Tarim population was genetically isolated with zero Indo-European ancestry, how did an Indo-European language end up here at all? The answer, according to linguists, is that Tocharian likely arrived later, through Afanasyevo-related migrants who settled first in the neighboring Dzungarian basin, then spread language and culture southward over generations, without a single dramatic wave of population replacement. The lesson is simple and important. Genetics, language, and culture don't always travel together. They can split off completely, moving through trade and contact long after the people who originally carried them have blended in or vanished from the historical record entirely. This isn't an isolated case either. From Bronze Age Britain to ancient Egypt to the Americas, ancient DNA has repeatedly blown up long-standing theories built on nothing more than visual observation and educated guesswork. What makes Tarim stand out isn't just that researchers got it wrong, it's how long an entire field treated an untested guess as settled fact, for nearly a century, until the data finally forced a rewrite. And here's the part worth sitting with if you're drawn to alternative history or hidden truth content. This case proves the opposite of a cover-up. No lost civilization, no ancient astronauts, no secret suppressed by a shadowy institution. Mainstream, peer-reviewed scientists were the ones who tore down the old theory, publishing openly in one of the most rigorously reviewed journals on Earth. Nobody suppressed this. Science corrected itself the moment better tools arrived. This video walked through exactly what scientists actually found inside the Taklamakan Desert, why their initial theories about Indo-European migrants turned out to be wrong, and what the real genetic evidence eventually proved about one of the most genuinely isolated populations in recorded human history. No fabricated shock, no invented claim, just a real reversal that took nearly a century of careful, patient science to finally uncover. Take a second to actually process that timeline. A single population cut off, adapting, surviving for well over 1,000 years, inside a desert whose own name translates to a warning. No rescue migration, no outside civilization swooping in to explain their existence. Just resourcefulness, generation after generation, until the sand finally preserved the proof. Before wrapping this up, it's worth sitting with just how much patience this kind of discovery actually requires, both from the researchers involved and from the scientific process itself. These mummies were first pulled out of the sand decades before anyone had the genetic tools necessary to properly interpret what they were actually looking at, meaning an entire generation of archaeologists had to work with incomplete information, form their best reasonable hypothesis based on available evidence, and then wait, sometimes for decades, for technology to finally catch up enough to confirm or correct that earlier work. That's not a flaw in how science operates. It's exactly how it's supposed to work, one careful correction at a time, built on evidence rather than certainty for its own sake. The truth here didn't need any exaggeration to be compelling. A population directly linked through deep ancestry to both modern Europeans and Native Americans, surviving for well over 1,000 years inside one of the most hostile deserts on Earth, making the world's oldest confirmed cheese along the way, is a stranger and more fascinating story than almost anything a fabricated headline could have invented on its own. If this changed how you think about who actually lived in ancient Central Asia, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive into real archaeological mysteries. Share this with someone who loves ancient history and drop a comment below telling us which detail from this story surprised you the most.